Hello, friends. Please pay attention.
President Trump has drawn a new strategic map, stretching from Greenland to the Gulf of Mexico to the Panama Canal and its neighboring countries. At the Department of War, we call this strategic map Greater North America. Why? Because every sovereign nation and territory north of the equator, from Greenland to Ecuador and from Alaska to Ghana, is not part of the global South.
War Secretary Hayes introduced a new Trump administration concept, Greater North America. Every nation from Greenland to the Panama Canal is no longer in the global South. They are now included in Trump's Greater North America map. This concept carries extremely important significance. Once you understand it, you'll be able to understand everything the Trump administration is currently doing, whether it's the war against Iran in the Middle East or the news that broke yesterday about Trump preparing to send troops to Cuba. All of these seemingly unrelated actions are actually serving the same strategic goal. What goal is that? My friends, this is a particularly important episode. Please give me 20 minutes of your time and make sure to watch until the very end of today's program. Let's first clarify the timeline. On March 5th, Hayes hosted an event called the America's Anti-Cartel Conference at the Southern Command. 17 countries attended: Argentina, El Salvador, Ecuador, Panama, Paraguay, Bolivia, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic. Including the United States itself, a total of 17 countries signed a joint security declaration. But note that there are a few names missing from the list. Mexico didn't come, Brazil didn't come, Colombia didn't come, and neither did Canada. These absent countries happen to be some of the largest economies in Latin America. Why didn't they come? We'll come back to this question in a moment. 2 days later, on March 7th, the scene shifted from the Southern Command to Trump's own golf resort. On this day, Trump personally hosted a summit of even higher profile. It was called the Shield of the Americas. The heads of state from 12 countries attended: Argentina's President Milei, El Salvador's president, Paraguay's president, and Chile's newly elected President Cast all came. At this summit, Trump signed a presidential proclamation, officially establishing the weekly anti-cartel alliance. He told the Latin American leaders present that the only way to defeat these enemies is to unleash military power. We must deploy the military, and you must deploy your militaries as well. Just imagine, to eliminate drug cartels, we have to use the military. Some of you might wonder, is it really necessary? It is, but for the United States, it's absolutely necessary. So why resort to military force if it's not absolutely necessary? Watch until the end and you'll understand why. This is the background behind the birth of the Greater North America concept. You'll see that it's not an academic idea, nor is it a report proposed by a think tank. Instead, it's a new strategic map unveiled by the Pentagon at a military conference. It is accompanied by real, live-fire military operations. So how did it come about, and how should we understand it? Before we go any further, I need to take you back 200 years to a crucial historical turning point, because if we don't understand this period of history, we won't be able to truly grasp the significance of the Greater North America concept. Let's go back to 1823. The fifth President of the United States, James Monroe, stood in the Capitol and delivered his annual State of the Union address. At that time, the United States had only 24 states and a population of less than 10 million. 9 years earlier, British troops had marched into Washington and set fire to the White House and the Capitol. But by 1823, President Monroe's greatest concern was no longer Britain. What worried him most was another organization called the Holy Alliance. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed an organization known as the Holy Alliance, whose purpose was to defend monarchy and suppress all revolutions. In 1823, the Holy Alliance had just helped the King of Spain restore his autocratic power and suppress the constitutional movement within Spain. Many people feared that their next step would be to help Spain reclaim all of its newly independent Latin American colonies. At the same time, the Russians were continuously expanding southward in the northwestern Pacific, advancing from Alaska toward Oregon. If the Tsar and the Holy Alliance managed to gain a foothold in the New World, then America's dream of expanding along the West Coast would be completely over. Britain also saw the same threat. Although Britain was also a monarchy, it was not aligned with the Holy Alliance and cared more about trade. If the Latin American countries reverted to being Spanish colonies, then Spain's mercantilist policies would shut British merchants out. So British Foreign Secretary George Canning took the initiative to approach the United States with a suggestion. Hey, why don't our two countries issue a joint statement warning the European powers not to meddle in the Americas? Monroe initially agreed, but then his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, said something. Adams said something that changed everything. Rather than being a small boat trailing behind the British fleet, why don't we make our own independent statement? Monroe thought it over and realized it made sense, so he decided to go it alone. On December 2, 1823, in his State of the Union address, he declared that the American continent was no longer open to colonization by any European power, and that any external force attempting to impose its own political system to the Western Hemisphere would be regarded by the United States as a threat to its own security. And this was the birth of the Monroe Doctrine. But to be honest, at the time, Europeans didn't take this seriously at all. How could a former colony with a population of less than 10 million and a weak military have the right to draw boundaries? And what about the leaders of the Latin American countries? Although they appreciated Monroe's good intentions, they knew very well in their hearts that what truly protected them from being reconquered by Europeans was the British Royal Navy, not Monroe's speeches. So in the first few decades, the Monroe Doctrine was basically just an empty promise. It wasn't until 40 years later that this empty promise was finally called in, and the way it was fulfilled was full of drama. In 1862, the French Emperor Napoleon III did something big. He sent troops to invade Mexico. The trigger for this was a debt issue. Mexico had just finished a civil war, the national treasury was empty, and they announced a suspension of foreign debt payments. So Britain, Spain, and France joined forces and sent troops to collect the debt. But Britain and Spain soon realized that the French had much bigger ambitions than just debt collection. Napoleon III wanted to establish a French empire in the Americas. Initially, the French army was defeated by the Mexican forces outside the city of Puebla. That date was May 5th, which is the origin of Mexico's famous Cinco de Mayo holiday. But Napoleon III was not willing to accept defeat, so he sent even more troops. In 1863, the French captured Mexico City. The following year, they supported Archduke Maximilian of the Austrian Habsburg dynasty in ascending to the throne as Emperor of Mexico. This was the first blatant challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. However, the problem was that the United States was in the midst of the Civil War at the time. The Lincoln administration refused to recognize Maximilian's regime, but was unable to send troops. It wasn't until 1865, after the Civil War ended, that the United States suddenly had its hands free. General Sheridan stationed a large army on the US-Mexico border, ostensibly to pursue the remaining Southern forces. In reality, they were secretly supplying the Mexican Republican forces with more than 30,000 rifles. At that time, Secretary of State Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine to issue an ultimatum to France. Withdraw your troops or bear the consequences. In the end, Napoleon III withdrew his forces. Without the backing of the French army, the Maximilian Empire quickly collapsed, and in the end, he was captured and killed by the Mexican Republican forces. A famous oil painting by the French artist Manet depicts the scene of Maximilian's execution. This was the first real test of the Monroe Doctrine, a direct confrontation with France. The United States won and drove France out. But you'll notice that this was purely defensive in nature. Basically, don't come over here, I'm warning you. This was the first original phase of the Monroe Doctrine. What happened next was different. The Monroe Doctrine would shift from defense to offense. There was a very specific trigger for this change, which occurred in 1902, once again in Venezuela. In 1901, Venezuelan President Cipriano Castro declared that the country was unable to repay its foreign debts, and the European creditors had reached the end of their patience. So, in December 1902, a joint fleet from Britain, Germany, and Italy sailed directly to the Venezuelan coast, blockaded the ports, seized warships, and bombarded coastal fortresses. At that time, the President of the United States was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt's initial attitude was actually rather indifferent. He said, if any South American country does something to wrong the Europeans, then let the Europeans teach them a lesson. But when he realized that the Germans' ambitions were not just about collecting debts and teaching South America a lesson, because the German Navy was evaluating the possibility of establishing a permanent military base in the Caribbean, At this point, Roosevelt became alert. He quietly did something. He appointed George Dewey, the only admiral of the Navy in U.S. history, as the commander of the Atlantic Fleet. Then, he announced the largest naval exercise in American history near Puerto Rico, with 4 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 2 gunboats all assembled in the Caribbean Sea. Coincidentally, the location of this exercise happened to be right next to the waters where the British and Germans were blockading Venezuela. Roosevelt also arranged a private dinner at the White House, inviting both the German diplomats and Admiral Dewey to dine together. The message was very clear. You Germans, take a look. This is my fleet commander, and his forces are right next to you. This was the second implementation of the Monroe Doctrine, and once again, the Europeans withdrew. Although the United States didn't suffer any losses, what about Roosevelt? He learned a lesson from this incident. Simply driving out outsiders wasn't enough. If Latin American countries couldn't manage their own affairs for a long time, constantly falling into debt or civil unrest, then Europeans would have an excuse to come and intervene again and again. So what should be done? Roosevelt thought that rather than letting Europeans take charge, it would be better for the US to step in and take control. So in 1904, Roosevelt announced that if any country in the Western Hemisphere engaged in prolonged misconduct, the United States had the right and responsibility to exercise international police power and intervene. This is known as the Roosevelt Corollary, and it is the origin of America's big stick policy. Roosevelt had a famous saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." From then on, American troops repeatedly entered and managed Latin America. In 1903, the U.S. supported Panama's independence from Colombia in exchange for the right to build the canal. Then they sent troops to the Dominican Republic, occupied Haiti, intervened in Nicaragua, landed in Honduras, and so on and so forth. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the boots of American soldiers practically trampled every inch of land in the Caribbean and Central America. At this point, the Monroe Doctrine had already evolved to version 2.0, shifting from its original defensive stance to an offensive one. Then came the Cold War era, and the Monroe Doctrine developed into version 3.0 as it was given a new mission, anti-communism. In 1962, when the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, Kennedy once again invoked the Monroe Doctrine at a press conference, essentially saying that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence and the Soviet Union must not interfere. In the end, the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles. In the 1980s, Reagan applied the Monroe Doctrine to the anti-communist battlegrounds of Central America, supporting the anti-communist guerrillas in Nicaragua and funding the right-wing government in El Salvador, firmly maintaining that the Western Hemisphere is America's backyard. If communism dared to enter, the US would fight back. By 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the threat of communism disappeared. All of a sudden, America's biggest rival in the Western Hemisphere was gone, and the Monroe Doctrine lost its most important enemy. After that, America's attention shifted. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, ISIS. The United States devoted its best troops and greatest efforts to the Middle East and Central Asia. Latin America was completely neglected, and during these 30 years when the United States ignored Latin America, another major power quietly moved in. Who is this major power? We'll talk about that in a moment. Then came Trump. What Trump did was different from Monroe, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Reagan. Now, at this point, I want to mention a detail that you might not have noticed. Although this detail is small, it reveals the true mindset of the Trump administration. After Trump took office, he changed the name of the U.S. Department of Defense back to the Department of War. As a result, Hegseth's title changed from Defense Secretary to Secretary of War. This is not just a simple name change. When the United States was founded, what Washington established was the Department of War. This name was used all the way until 1947, after the start of the Cold War, when it was changed to the Department of Defense. The implication was that we would no longer be on the offensive, but only defend ourselves. But when Trump changed the name back, the message he sent was very clear. Stop talking about defense. I'm here to fight. Secretary of War Hegseth said that President Trump has re-established the Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or as it can be simply called, the Donor Doctrine. The Donor Doctrine, DON, is the abbreviation for Donald Trump. When you combine Don from Donald and Monroe, you get Donroe, referring to Trump's Monroe Doctrine. This term first appeared on the front page of the New York Post on January 8th last year. On the cover, Trump is pointing at a map. Canada has an X marked over it with the words Week 51, Greenland is labelled our territory, and the Panama Canal is marked as Panama. At the time, many people didn't take it seriously and thought it was just a gimmick. It wasn't until the end of last year, on the 202nd anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, that the White House issued an official presidential statement declaring that the Trump administration proudly reaffirms this commitment and adds a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Immediately after, this Trump corollary was formally written into the U.S. National Security Strategy document. Fast forward to the early morning of January 3, 2026, U.S. Special Forces launched a raid on Caracas and captured Maduro and his wife from Venezuela's largest military base. This is the ultimate interpretation of Trump's Monroe Doctrine. Before this, there was a long prelude called Operation Southern Spear. Starting from last August, the United States began deploying a large number of warships to the Caribbean. First came the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, then destroyers and nuclear submarines, and finally even the USS Ford aircraft carrier was sent over. This was something that hadn't happened since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This was the largest military buildup by the United States in the Caribbean, officially under the pretext of combating drug trafficking. However, there are some figures that show this mission was far more than that. According to calculations by US defense media, the total value of all the drug traffickers' speedboats destroyed doesn't even compare to the cost of operating the USS Ford aircraft carrier in Venezuelan waters for just one day. The cost of operating it and each drone munition used to kill the crew members is about 66,000 times the pay each crew member receives. 66,000 times. In other words, the US used the world's most expensive weapon systems to bomb a few people sitting on speedboats, each making only $500 per trip smuggling drugs. Isn't this a bit like using a cannon to shoot a mosquito? So why does the United States still do this? If we connect the things we just mentioned, capturing Maduro, raiding speedboats, the Shield of the Americas summit, and the big North American map, you'll see a pattern. You'll notice a clear logical chain. Drugs are just the entry point. What the Trump administration really wants to target is another objective. That objective is the elephant in the room. That is the expansion of the Chinese Communist Party's influence in the Western Hemisphere. Let's look at some numbers. First, China is now the largest trading partner for almost every country in South America, with the only exception being Colombia. China ranks second. Back in the year 2000, trade between China and Latin America was only $12 billion, but today it has surpassed $500 billion. In 25 years, it has increased more than 40-fold. Third, at the peak of the Belt and Road Initiative, 22 out of 33 Latin American countries signed agreements. China has been building ports, railways, investing in mines, constructing power plants, and building stadiums in Latin America. In Peru, there is a super port with a $3.5 billion investment from China. Ecuador's copper and gold mines have been acquired by Jiangxi Copper. In Chile and Argentina, large amounts of Chinese capital have poured into lithium mines. China has built a national stadium in El Salvador that is about to become the largest in Central America. So do you see the problem? The United States spent 30 years fighting wars in the Middle East, while China spent 30 years building infrastructure in America's backyard. Among all these forms of influence, the most sensitive and critical one is the Panama Canal. Globally, 5% to 6% of trade passes through the Panama Canal, and 40% of America's container shipping goes through here. It is the most critical strategic choke point connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. One of the main reasons Roosevelt first proposed the Roosevelt Corollary was that he was building the Panama Canal at the time and needed to ensure that the area around the canal would be free from European influence. Now, 122 years later, Trump has put forward the Trump Corollary. The core issue is still the Panama Canal, but this time the opponent is no longer European warships, but Chinese capital. With that said, let's take another look at the true meaning behind this map of Greater North America, what it represents on the surface. On the surface, it's about fighting drugs, cracking down on cartels, protecting the border, and stopping illegal immigration. But on a deeper level, it's about countering China, pushing back and completely squeezing out the pervasive economic influence of the Chinese Communist Party from the Western Hemisphere, from the Panama Canal to lithium mines to ports. The United States wants to take them all back, one by one. There is also a third layer. At the anti-cartel conference, Hegeseth made a statement. If we reflect on it carefully, we'll realize that what he said carries more weight than any military action. He told the representatives present that everyone there was a descendant of Western civilization, and that the challenge we face is whether our countries can continue to be Christian nations under God, with strong borders and prosperous people as Western countries are. You see, this is no longer just the language of security. This is a narrative about civilization and culture. He is drawing a line. On our side is the West, Christianity, and the civilization led by the United States. China, that is, the system represented by the Chinese Communist Party, is on the other side. You have to choose a side. This is the essence of Greater North America. In terms of security, it is America's defensive line. Economically, the goal is to squeeze out the CCP, and in terms of civilization, the aim is to firmly lock this region within the framework of Western Christian civilization. So the war against communism is right at our doorstep. This is the 21st century version of Trump's Monroe Doctrine. Only now the enemy has shifted from European monarchs to the Chinese Communist Party. Friends, do you agree with what I'm saying? Comment below. To end today's program, I recommend this year's Shen performance. Loved globally, it's also what the CCP fears most. Why is the Chinese Communist Party so afraid? I think you'll understand once you see it for yourself. And as for those who love Shen Yun, they include many prominent figures from all walks of life around the world. Friends, I'm sure many of you have seen The Lord of the Rings. Do you remember the actress who played the Elf Queen? Her name is Cate Blanchett. She also played Queen Elizabeth Fudd of England. She and her family have seen Shen Yun, and her review was that the performance was exquisitely beautiful, an extraordinary experience for both me and my children. And then there's Stuart F. Lane, who is the most influential theatre producer on Broadway. After watching Shen Yun, he commented that the performance was absolutely wonderful and deeply inspiring to him. Just think about what kind of show could inspire such an industry leader. So this is truly a show you shouldn't miss, whether it's because of why it makes the Chinese Communist Party so fearful, or because it's a performance deeply connected to our Chinese cultural roots, or simply because of the unanimous high praise it receives from world celebrities. You really shouldn't miss the Shen Yun performance. I will be watching Shen Yun this Sunday afternoon at Lincoln Center in New York. Now, I sincerely invite my friends to come and join me. We can meet and chat before the show starts and during intermission, and most importantly, enjoy this unparalleled performance together. I've pinned the ticket purchase link at the top of the comments section. Sunday afternoon, Lincoln Center in New York. Let's make sure to meet there. By the way, friends, when you book your tickets, you can use my exclusive code, which is the initials of my name in Pinyin, ZF2026. It's easy to remember, ZF2026. Use this code when booking to waive your ticketing fees in the United States. All right, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy my show, don't forget to give me a like. New friends, you're welcome to subscribe to Jen's Perspective. Let's not miss each other in the next episode. Bye-bye.